Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories of outrageous art heists of some important works of art. First, he tells the story of the Altarpiece of Ghent, one of the most stolen artworks in history, and the unlikely robbery that is still unsolved to this day. Then he tells the story of Goya's Wellington, which was stolen from the National Gallery in London in a brazen but amateur attempt to get retirees television licenses. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
In the 1420s, two brothers began work on what would become one of the most important paintings in the Western world. Little could they know as they began the massive, multi-paneled work that travails that it would go through in hundreds of years of war and strife, only to survive almost intact into the modern day. It was transformative in its time, considered by many art historians to be the first major oil painting, and it has been admired by millions of people since it was created. So admired, in fact, that it has become famous as one of the most stolen works of art in the world. And among its many thefts, one stands out because it is the only time that a piece of this amazing work was stolen, never to be returned. It is a historical whodunit that deserves to be remembered.
The Ghent Altarpiece, properly titled The Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, was commissioned in the 1420s by the mayor of the Flemish city of Ghent, Audacious and his wife Lisbeth. Both were members of powerful families, and Audacious was one of the most politically powerful men of the city. In this period, Ghent was one of the largest and most important cities in all of Europe. In the 13th century, it had become the second largest city in Europe north of the Alps, second only to Paris, and it was larger than either Cologne or Moscow. As many as 65,000 people lived within the city's walls, and while it was nominally part of the Burgundian state, the city was powerful and wealthy enough to be ruled essentially as a city-state. It became wealthy especially through the wool trade and the production of cloth, and became heavily industrialized in the High Middle Ages. The Adoration of the Mystic Lamb is huge, made up of 12 panels arranged in 2 registers or levels. The individual panels can be closed, and on its outer panels are another 8 panels. Fully open, the piece measures 5.2 meters by 3.75 meters, or roughly 17 feet by 12 feet 4 inches. Altogether, the large panels with their paintings weigh 2.5 tons. According to a now-lost inscription that had been on the frame, the piece was created by 2 brothers, Hubert and Jan van Eyck. Jan is considerably more famous, and was considered even in his own time as one of the best painters of the era. Jan, however, left an inscription, now lost, that credits Hubert as major quo nemo repertus, greater than anyone, and Jan as arte secundus, or second best in art. Its construction and planning in the 1420s are generally thought to have been carried out by Hubert, who died in 1426, leaving the piece to be completed by Jan in 1432. Whatever the circumstances of its painting, by 1432 it was displayed in the St. Bravo Cathedral. Originally, the altarpiece also included a large carved outer frame and surround, which may have included clockwork mechanisms which could move the shutters or play music. This outer frame was destroyed during the Reformation, and little information about it survives. When open, 12 panels depict hundreds of figures. In the top register, there is at the center Christ, flanked by the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist. The next panels out depict heavenly choirs, and the outermost depict a naked Adam and Eve. The lower register holds a single scene depicting hundreds of figures surrounding a lamb. Full of Christian iconography, the panels are painted with incredible detail, and when closed, 8 panels are displayed, painted less vibrantly to contrast with the inner images and depicting more religious figures.
In general, the altarpiece remained closed except on feast days.
Even in its earliest days, the piece was coveted as a symbol of wealth and power, was moved numerous times, has been the victim of significant crime and theft. A fire in the 16th century destroyed the painting's platform, which had depicted hell, and during the Protestant Reformation, the entire piece was removed from the church to save it from the Great Iconoclasm, in which groups destroyed various religious images and paintings as heretical. The work was plundered during the French Revolution and exhibited at the Louvre until it was returned in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. Much of the painting was then pawned for a pittance by the Diocese of Ghent, and would be sold eventually to King Frederick William III of Prussia and displayed in the Berlin Museum. Some panels remained in Ghent, but were seized by German forces during World War I. The Treaty of Versailles stipulated the return of the entire work in compensation for acts of destruction during the war. Despite its harrowing journeys, the paintings themselves remained intact by 1934 and in the same location where they had originally been installed more than 500 years before in Ghent. All of that changed on the morning of April 11th, 1934. That day, a steward at the church began his morning rounds when he noticed that the door to the chapel had been left unlocked. When he entered, fearful of what he might find, it appeared nothing was amiss. It wasn't until later that he removed the cover from the altarpiece to find that one of the panels of the great painting was missing. A note was left behind in the frame that said, "Taken from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles."
The Germans simply were not happy that the painting had been returned to Belgium. Not so much at stake because of the pieces that had been stolen by soldiers during the war, but the larger piece of the painting had been legitimately bought after the painting had been sold from Ghent in 1815.
According to historian Michael J. Kurtz, the Germans bitterly resented the loss of the panels. In their place in the German museum where they had once hung, a note was left reading, "Taken from Germany by the Treaty of Versailles." The Knoxville, Tennessee Journal reported that the space in front of the placards was a favorite spot on which to gather for a new strafing of the Allies, a perfect symbol spot to grouse about the humiliation and punishment doled out to Germany at the end of the Great War. The piece that was stolen was the Just Judges or Righteous Judges panel, along with its accompanying opposite side image, John the Baptist. The two pieces were actually separate, as they had been sawed apart in 1894, so both sides of the panel could be displayed at once. According to the newspaper The Guardian, when the theft was initially reported, the police commissioner only examined the scene briefly, as a large crowd had gathered, and instead returned to a case nearby that he had already been investigating, a theft on the same night, from a cheese shop. The police apparently had no clues, but the investigation was kept quiet. 19 days later, when a ransom note was sent to the Ghent bishop, the thieves demanded 1,000,000 Belgian francs for the return of the panels. According to the Staffordshire Evening Sentinel, the amount demanded was the equivalent to about £8,500. Adjusted for inflation, the demand was about £650,000 or $800,000. The letter included instructions for how the money would be passed to the thieves, as well as instructions for the bishop to respond in the small ads of a Belgian paper. The letter was signed D.U.A. The diocese passed the letter to the authorities, but declared themselves willing to raise the ransom.
Authorities, including agents of the Crown, were, however, more interested in catching the perpetrators. The government decided that since the painting was a national treasure, that the interests of the nation superseded those of the diocese.
Letters continued to arrive. On May 26th, the third letter included a receipt for a luggage office in Brussels, where the thieves had left as a gesture of good faith the panel of the painting of St. John the Baptist. The railway employee could only say that the man who left the package was about 50 years old. The next letter demanded that the 1,000,000 francs be delivered to a vicar in Antwerp. The police instead gave the vicar only 25,000 francs, along with a letter of demands. On June 14th, a taxi stopped at the vicar's house in the afternoon, taking the package in exchange for a piece of newspaper. The vicar's housekeeper reported that someone in the back seat of the taxi was wearing glasses. Of course, the thieves were unhappy about the package. They stressed that they had risked their lives to take the panels, and that what they asked was not excessive. They called the police demands, primarily about how the panel would be exchanged, unacceptable. They now demanded that they would only return the panel after receiving the ransom, offering only to return the panel for 500,000 francs and for an additional 400,000 to be delivered a year later. If the offer wasn't accepted, the author wrote that it would result in the automatic destruction of one of the most beautiful showpieces of history. Letters and responses continued to pass in the following months, but little was gained, with the authorities refusing to budge and DUA continuing to threaten the panel. The 13th and last letter was received on October 2nd, offering again that the panel could be saved, but also including the following passage. Please accept, Monsignor, my honorable regards, as well as my regret that you did not treat the people in this historical matter with enough dignity. No more letters were received. On November 25th, 1934, there was a meeting at the Holy Mary College in Dendermonde. One of the speakers, Arsène Hodetier, was struck by either a heart attack or stroke and forced to his deathbed. He told his lawyer that he was the only one who knows where the mystic lamb is, and directed him to an envelope in his desk. There, the lawyer found copies of the letters and a handwritten 14th letter. I am the only one in this world who knows where the just judges rest, Hodetier wrote. It rests, he said, in a place where nor I nor anybody else can take it without catching the attention of the public. They found 3 keys, including one to a roof door at the cathedral in Ghent, and a luggage receipt to the typewriter on which he wrote the letters. The confession wasn't reported to the police for a month.
The authorities concluded that he was the thief, but the location of the painting remains unknown, even 90 years later. Ever since it was stolen, there has been a detective assigned to the case.
Mystery still surrounds the case. Hodetier was an odd man. He'd worked for the church, though not at the St. Bravo Cathedral, but by 1934 he worked as a stockbroker. He was a painter, an avid reader of detective novels, and himself an amateur detective who had followed various local cases. He had a collection of novels by Maurice Leblanc, in which a criminal communicated through newspapers with initials. Later investigation included a servant who recalled him being angry when she caught him wrapping up a long object in May of that year. Karl Mortier, chief of the Ghent police from 1974 to 1991, discovered a reference that Hodetier had night blindness, was too short to have committed the crime himself. The letters always use we and reference other friends possibly involved. What few other suspects have been examined have not been proven to be involved.
Mortier also found out that Hodetier already had more than 1 million francs in the bank, making his motive less clear.
The police have been accused of bungling the case. They failed to question the lawyer or any of the other men who had been with Hodetier the day he died. They never looked for fingerprints on the letters or the typewriter, and not staked out post offices, although they knew where the letters were coming from. They didn't question Hodetier's wife, who said that her husband had made a few strange comments. If I had to go looking for the panel, I would look outside of St. Bravo, he allegedly said. She also said that she heard him say the painting was only moved, not stolen. His sickly son, 13 years old, died just 6 months afterwards, muttering, "Police, thieves, police, thieves." The police became convinced that the painting was somewhere in or near the cathedral, but neither their searches nor extensive searches in the years since have found it. The man who was found to have committed the theft from the cheese shop and another witness claimed to have seen a black car at the cathedral the night of the robbery, and the cheese thief even identified the 2 men in the car 13 years later in 1947. One was a local smuggler, but the name of the other isn't certain, as the police seem to have never written the name down. During World War II, there was an effort to preserve the painting by sending it to the Vatican in Rome. The painting was en route when Italy joined the Axis, and so was instead stored at a museum in France. In 1942, it was seized by the Nazis at Adolf Hitler's direct order, and in 1945 it was recovered by the Allied Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives program and returned to Ghent.
But the panel was still missing. In fact, after the Nazis seized the painting, they tried to track down the missing panel, but without success.
Mortier believed that there may have been a cover-up and that members of the church itself may have aided in the theft, possibly because they had lost money in investment, which could connect them to Hodetier, the stockbroker. And more mysteries abound. In 1938, a lawyer approached the government on behalf of an anonymous client, claiming to have the painting, and offered to return it for 500,000 francs. The offer was turned down. The same year, another painter and famous restoration artist, Jan van der Wecken, made a copy of the work without any prompting. It has some differences from the original, but investigators have wondered, did he have on hand the original to use as a reference? Some even believe that he had merely painted over the original, although that has proven to be untrue. The copy was eventually sold to the cathedral and now takes the place of the original.
The only thing certain about the theft is that the piece remains missing. And since it was stolen, hundreds of different theories have arisen, from alleged conspiracies to the belief that Hodetier's last letter contained some sort of code.
None of it has made it any clearer what happened that April night. Was Hodetir the mastermind, a conspirator, or just a scapegoat? No one is sure. And except for him, no truly convincing suspects have been identified, and the panel itself remains officially lost, even while amateur and professional sleuths continue to try to solve this historical mystery.
Some believe that the painting was destroyed long ago, and others have spent decades poring through every clue and searching through every inch of the cathedral. In its most recent restoration, the copy of the Just Judges panel was not restored in order to emphasize that the original is still missing, and in the hope that it may yet be found.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. So one of the things that's really interesting to me about paintings and painters like this, especially, this kind of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, it's amazing how much they relied on the specific wealth of a town.
Mm-hmm.
Or a group of people, and
absolutely,
the Van Eycks and this painting in particular have to do with the Northern Renaissance, as they call it, which is kind of as the Renaissance happened north of the Alps. Because usually when you talk about the Renaissance, you're talking about the Italian Renaissance.
Yeah.
And you're talking about Florence, where they did all kinds of. Again, that's all this famous stuff. But again, they were all tied, to these one places.
Yeah, every great artist of the Renaissance period had a patron because it was expensive to do what you did, and you had to be able to devote a lot of time to it. But just the acquisition of the pigments and stuff was extremely expensive and complex, as well as the time to become a master in painting. Actually in the Dutch Renaissance, I think that was fairly common that they would essentially be patronized by a city. It said there would be a diocese or a city or something, and they would be kind of that city's artist. And that's how they would make their living. So it is interesting that you have these great artists and they are tied to that location so very specifically.
Yeah, and this is a place where,
it is
not all that common.
This thing is huge. Just the commission to paint the Ghent Altarpiece. Is absolutely. That's a lifetime sort of commission, and as a matter of fact, it might have killed the older Van Eyck, right? The older brother didn't live through it, and it was so. Jan Van Eyck is better known. But he might have taken over this project in the middle. But that's how big a piece this is.
Yeah, it might have all been planned by the older brother. I think it's interesting that he mentioned, this my brother is the best in everything, and yet he's the one who's more famous.
That might have been referring to the painting itself. It might have simply been saying he was the supervisor. I was the second. It might not have been, he might not have been. I'm not sure how many brothers are going to agree that he was the best at everything all the time or anything like that. It might be referring to this one piece. But it is true. And it might be, though, because why am I forgetting the older brother's name? But
Hubert, I think.
Hubert. He might have, his life's work might have been getting halfway through the Ghent Altarpiece, the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. And so it's just that his brother not only got to build his trade underneath his brother, and not only got to take a big part of this very important piece, but he was still around in order to use that fame to become the artist that he was. But this piece is so interesting because it is, in terms of art history, it's an extremely important piece in terms of one of the first oil paintings and representing this whole Renaissance movement, Northern Renaissance movement, etc. And that it has survived this long. Extraordinary given the conflict that's gone on around it, and that it's been stolen so many times. The most stolen piece of art in history. You've got all of these panels, it all fits together very complexly. It's hundreds of years old, and it's been packed up and stolen by by the Nazis, and by in the one piece is still not been found. So it's really, there's so many twists and turns in the story. It's just fascinating. But it does start out with this piece is so tied to that community, so tied to that church, so tied to that diocese. It is literally, it's kind of the living history, the breathing, heart-beating history, and that's why it's so important to the people, and that's why its story becomes so. It's not just art. It is truly art as history.
Well, and it's there were multiple pieces of it that haven't survived to the modern day. There's the platform which had hell depicted on it, which is totally destroyed. There's whatever this outer frame would have looked like that could have been clockwork and engineering. Just thinking about what it would have taken. And even the
inscription where Jan says that Hubert was the best. Yeah, that's missing still too. Yeah.
Yeah, and
but
so
the art remains except for one panel.
Yeah.
which might be under the floorboard somewhere. I mean,
Possibly.
one of the biggest theories is that it's still in the church. So you imagine after this much searching, it's not stuck in the broom closet, right?
I hear they've looked real thoroughly, but I mean, who knows where this thing is?
Did you check under the chair?
It does seem like you're like, man, if someone hit it in that church, they hit it really
well. It's huge.
good.
It's a massive cathedral. So I mean, But I mean, they've had a couple of 100 years of hide and seek for this. So you think that by now? Really... Well, no. I mean, it was 1930s, right? So it's not quite 100 years of hide and seek. You would think that if it was in there, someone would have stumbled on it by now.
Crazy that they haven't, but who knows? I mean, maybe it was destroyed back then.
Maybe it was, or maybe it was destroyed when someone realized that they weren't going to get the money for it, and they were afraid they were going to get caught. Or so maybe it doesn't exist, or maybe it's buried in a grave nearby. Or I mean, there's 100 theories about where it is. It's fascinating that it just disappeared and that it has never been recovered, because all the evidence seems to suggest that it couldn't have gotten very far away from the church. Yeah.
Well, and it's a tragedy, to have something like that survives so long and survives all these. I mean, Napoleon steals it, the freaking diocese sells it, and the King of Prussia buys part of it, and they still manage to get it back and bring it to Ghent. And
Germans are still a little mad about that.
Yeah, that might have been part of why it got stolen, right?
So and that actually, I mean, there's a lot of this that actually mirrors some other artifacts, including the other one that we're going to talk about today. But it's extraordinary given what it's been through that it's still around. And actually, it's in the news recently because they're doing a restoration, which of course they have to do a thing every few hundred years. And one of the things that they found out is that in previous restorations, they had significantly changed the work. Yeah. And so they are taking it back to its more original work, which if you look at it, I like at some point, because the name of it is the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. Yeah. And at some point, it was really kind of altered so that looked as if the lamb is a sacrifice, like an Isaac sacrifice, and they're draining blood out of it. When in fact, the mystic lamb represents Christ. And so the original mystic lamb had almost very creepily human face to it. Yeah. Because it was representing the sacrifice of Christ. And so you can imagine if you spent your entire life with that little bad lamb that someone, in the 15th century painted over and, made it look more like a lamb. And then now they're going back to the Van Eyck brothers original. That's quite a radical change. So it did survive, but it also changed radically in that time. And that is maybe best illustrated by this one panel that's, totally a reproduction because it was stolen.
It's a really interesting piece of history, how art restoration has changed and what we've done in art restoration too. I mean, when they altered it, they altered it for reasons, and whether that was just because they thought that the sheep looked creepy or because they had, they thought that was some kind of weird choice. Yeah, they were changing
how they saw doctrine. And it was a changing. Well, I mean, someday someone took a hammer and knocked all the bits off of the sculptures that were in the Vatican because they decided we couldn't have boy parts anymore. And these altarpieces are fascinating because if you go into any nice cathedral in Europe, they all have one, and it's always going to have multiple panels, and they're going to have it closed sometimes and open sometimes, and those have a lot of doctrinal meaning too, and they're all old, and so you wonder if in terms of the restorations. I mean, how much have they changed? So it's kind of interesting that even art, which you think was being kind of permanent, is actually changing with the times, and that you can go back, as a restorer, and you can literally go back through the history of that art. And so, I mean, this is just an illustration of all of that makes, art history so fascinating.
When you're changing what was changed, there's a question there about what is destruction and what is not and stuff like that. But it's, I mean, I understand also why you'd want it to be the original. This isn't known as whatever the restorer's name was. This is known as a Van Eyck piece. And
well, I mean, but that's the sensibility now. When they did the other restoration, and it might be how much money you have to pay the restorer. I mean, are you hiring the paint by numbers guy down the street? Or are you hiring someone? I mean, it's kind of hard to find someone who has the skill of a Van Eyck. But the sensibility today is that we want to go back to the original piece and do it the sensibility another time might have been that we have to tie this to the doctrine of where the church is today.
One of the things that I think of about how that's shifted, we did an episode on this dog named Barry, and he was a
Oh, that's right. It literally altered the stuffed dog to look
yeah.
more like people thought he should look like today.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
the breed didn't look the same back then, and so they changed it so it looked more like the modern breed.
Yeah, because people look and saying that's not a Saint Bernard. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
we use our breed standards to actually literally change dogs, and that is, dog breed history is really interesting because we've done others too, where I mean they didn't look the same as they look today. I mean, you think about that, and it's because we selectively breed dogs, but I mean that there's that history of the breed that you can literally see through the the nature of the dog, and the same dog that we're so used to today might look very different. Yeah. So if we're gonna alter Barry's stuffed form, because that's literally Barry that they have, to make him look more like people want him to be, then you can see how people were altering these pieces of art. But I mean, also time, the age changes them. Some things fade and things like that. And I mean, that's all part of the nature of art and the pigments that are used.
Well, and they all seem to have these, they get these little cracks and stuff like that. That's all just from age.
Of course they do. Well, I mean, they're oil painted. They're intended to be that way. Yeah. I mean, that's how oil paint works. But and then if someone's packing that thing up and running off with it, then you can see how that's
they tried to get it to Rome and it got stuck in
France and then captured by the Nazis.
And then
the Nazis tried to find the missing piece, and even they couldn't find the missing piece. I mean,
that's a little funny too. But they had actually cut the panels in half so that they could display both of them, which seems just like wanton destruction to me. Like
I mean, from the original piece, because I mean, imagine you've got a board and you're sawing it in half, lengthwise, without trying to harm the painting on either side. And who knows how thick the board was. I wonder how they did that. I would like to have seen the process for that.
Yeah,
but I mean, it's radical, and that's how you've lost things like the the clockwork mechanisms and all this other stuff. Because so I think if you looked at the sensibility today, this is if we were trying to preserve a piece of art, that we would be trying to preserve it in its it's perfect in natural form. But I mean, if you're looking over the course of hundreds of years, people look at those pieces differently.
Yeah.
But I mean, the Parthenon, because we did a story on that. I mean, the Parthenon perfectly preserved for thousands of years, and then just gets blown up in a stupid, pointless modern war by idiots with
who put a bunch of bombs in it deliberately. They put all their ammo in it because they figured they wouldn't.
They used that. They used it as an ammo dump, and then other people shot mortars at it. And and in a war that's the war is forgotten, and this ancient piece is so you can see why why we have the sensibility today. I mean, that's what we have today. But on the other hand, I mean, there's the United States is a big question over tearing down statues and changing names and etc.
Well, and what part of that is and I mean. It's always been a question of when you tear down a statue, what you do with it afterward.
Well, I mean, not just, but I mean, so there's all sorts of works of art and things like that have those questions. And so at some point, the politics of why we would take it down today will have passed by, over a few hundred years. No one would care, right?
Yeah.
But and then they might be thinking about, let's just talk about the art. But I mean, but in the moment, the politics of why we like or dislike a piece of art are more important. But when that piece has survived over 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 centuries, then it's the history is more important and people forget the politics. So who knows the politics of why we wanted a different looking lamb? But I mean, that might have been important at the time, and now we go back and look at it and say, we're.
Gosh, the iconoclasm, they had to protect it because at that point it was the fact that it was seen as essentially heretical was more important than the value of the piece of art separate from its religious meaning, and they would have been happy to burn it. And that's I mean I think today we see that as extremely abhorrent, but at the time clearly at the time there were people who thought that was abhorrent too, but maybe not all for the same reasons.
And there are people that are throwing soup at pieces of art now because they want to make a political statement about something else, or well, I mean, we find out too that there was because the feminist movement destroyed some art that was in, and that's there's been other cases where someone because they're angry or because they're crazy or whatever slash up a piece of art that's otherwise it's managed to live survive hundreds of years.
Yeah, someone did that to the that famous painting of Ivan the Terrible when he killed his son. Someone attacked that fairly recently, tried to attack that piece. I don't know. I'm very
Well, I
much in
mean,
this place where,
if you're trying to make a political point, then taking a priceless, ageless piece of art and destroying
yeah,
it, I mean, there's not much more power than that, right?
no. Well, and you can't. It's if you destroy it enough, you can't get it back. We've gotten pretty good at restoration these days, but it's still, I mean, this stuff is more ephemeral, and you think of how much art, from what did survive. I mean, how much of it didn't, and
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
it's
that's a fair
frightening.
point. Yeah.
There's a
So
lot of
hopefully,
stuff that gets
for the most
destroyed.
part, the best of it survived. But
You hope so, and people have
so
certainly.
the thing about this particular episode is that this Ghent Altarpiece represents all of that. It's
Yeah.
a fantastic mystery.
Oh yeah,
It's still and it says a lot about history that the cheese theft was more important at the moment, the wheel of cheese, and that the best evidence that we have was the guy that was stealing the cheese.
might
Been
have
the best
seen
witness that we had. I
someone.
mean, there's all parts of this that are just a crazy story, and then just the perplexing. Where is it? I mean, there are still detectives now saying it's got to be somewhere. But I guess it could have been in that time. It could have been moved in a huge distance, or it might have been destroyed by people who just didn't want to be.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? It might have been destroyed at the time. I mean, you can say, because I don't know that there was a lot of advantage to them destroying it because that was their only leverage. But on the other hand, if you destroy it, you might get away with the crime. And even if you didn't get the money, at least you're not going to.
Because they were jacking them around for the money. And it's
Yeah.
an interesting story that the man that obviously did it, or seems to have obviously masterminded it,
At least part
also
of it.
seems not to have been physically capable of
Yeah.
of doing the theft.
Well, and you don't know. I mean, he says the letters all said "we," but who knows what that means? I mean, you could just be saying "we" because you want to you're trying to throw them off the track, or I mean, it could have been part of some larger conspiracy.
But it's a weird story. He didn't need the money. He was
he
the
didn't need the
deacon of
money.
the church.
What
And
was he
so,
doing?
and there's some conspiracy theories that like the church was doing it to, to get people to donate or whatever.
Yeah,
So I mean, it's fascinating that this piece never, and they return, half of it. They return the John the Baptist piece,
yeah.
but they don't return just judges, and why? And then the other question is that the person that did the reproduction, it looks close enough to it that did they have the original with them?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's an
I mean,
interesting.
It
an
sounds
interesting
it
piece.
sounds like an inside job if you're a conspiracy theorist, but it certainly is weird by any story. So I mean, that mystery is fascinating, but this piece of art is fascinating. Honestly, in terms of the YouTube channel, art history doesn't always do that well.
Yeah,
But I think that there's art is part of who we are, defines who we are, and so when you have a history of a piece that's a historical piece in itself. I mean, that's more than talking about art. That's talking about our whole of society and how we understand society at any given time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an incredible, and you're right. Is that we talk about so much else about what's going on around this piece and what it means and all these different kind of connections you can make, and then ultimately you're still left with where is this piece? Where has it been? If it's been anywhere at this point, and you wonder if this guy was he the dude who masterminded it. He was clearly involved, or else he wouldn't have had these these copies of the letters, it seems like. But how else was it? How was it connected? It feels like the authorities failed on it, but I also understand.
Absolutely,
I mean, they're in a rough position, but it sure seems like they had some opportunities maybe to.
And then as well, the detective work is different than it is. I'm surprised there haven't been more movies on the detective work, but you still got to wonder someday they're gonna have to pull open a piece of drywall in order to fix some plumbing. And son of a gun, it's
There it is.
it's been in the wall all these years.
I really hope they find it.
They pull up the right piece of floor tile, or this pew's gotten old. We better take it out. Oh, look what's under the pew.
Ooh, I really hope that this stuff survives, because I think it's.
I sure hope so.
an
It is a
incredible
much
piece
better
of history.
story if it's somewhere
Yeah.
to be discovered than if someone threw it down the sewer or burned it in their fireplace. Yeah.
Well, if you like the History Guy, one thing you can do is you can travel with the History Guy. We've done some of those before, and we're going to do some more, including one in the summer that's going to London and the surrounding area.
It's a great time in the new year. It's a great time to really look at doing something special this year. Make a New Year's resolution to have fun. And I'll tell you the truth, I've done Take a Trip with a History Guy. It's a lot of fun. And what made it so special is not just that I'm there, because of course everybody loves my sparkling personality, but because this is people that are, when you get a group of people together that love the History Guy, you get a group of people together that share a lot of things. And we became very close best friends. The people that went with me on the last Take a Trip with a History Guy, we still talk almost every day. We have a chat channel and we've never given it up. And so this is a great opportunity for you to come and meet a bunch of people who share your passion, as well as the history guy, but you will find everybody on the strip is someone that you want to get to know. And it's a great trip to the United Kingdom. It is a really cool schedule. We really tried to put together something that did a lot of different things, goes to a lot of London neighborhoods. It does a lot of stuff, like the archery training and clay pigeon shooting and cocktail tasting. Goes down to the Cotswolds, which are beautiful, down to, and so I mean it's actually the schedule's fairly packed, but we're also going to have a fair amount of time to be able to choose to do some other things too, which we're talking about there. I'll also be out a couple days before and for probably about a week after. So anybody who wants to add days on, I'm certainly willing to figure out what anybody wants to do. I'm going to be, I hope, fingers crossed, going to Tank Fest. I hope I'm going to be part of the Tank Fest schedule again this year. That hasn't been confirmed yet, but been there before and love Tank Fest. If not, I'll just go down and watch him drive the tanks. But so take a trip with the history guy. This is a trip to London, June 15th to the 20th. Or it starts in London, but it's going to go all over the central UK there. And you can it's called Trova Trip. If you just look up Trova Trip, the history guy, you will see the sign up for London. Important, there are a few early bird seats still available. So if you get in quickly now, sign up quickly now, you get a bit of a discount. But if you want to come on the trip with us, you have to be signed up before March 3rd. That's the deadline. So we have a little bit of time to make a decision. But you know how it works. If you don't plan that trip, it doesn't happen. If you plan it now, you can plan your schedule around it. So sign up today. Go out today to Trova Trip, the history guy. Sign up for that trip to the United Kingdom with the history guy. It is going to be a lot of fun. We really there's lots more room for lots more signups. And I really, want to get a chance to meet you. So come along and spend some time with the history guy. I promise you that if you come on this trip, you will get good FaceTime with yours truly, the history guy.
Next up, the history guy tells the thrilling story of the theft of Goya's Wellington.
On August 21st, 1961, a portrait was stolen from London's National Gallery. The portrait had only been on display for 19 days before it was stolen, and authorities would search for the painting for years while receiving a series of ransom notes. The theft would eventually lead to a significant change in British law, and so affected the national psyche that it was made a minor plot element in a James Bond movie. The theft of Francisco Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington deserves to be remembered. Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, is considered by some historians to be one of the most brilliant military commanders of all time. He never lost a battle in his 32 years of service to the British Crown. Some of his most notable achievements took place during the Peninsula War, a conflict between Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire and the Spanish Crown. Wellington would go on to defeat Bonaparte at the famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Wellington's portrait, painted from 1812 to 1814 by the legendary Spanish court painter Francisco Goya, was commissioned by the Spanish Crown because of Wellington's service in the Peninsular War, including helping to free the city of Madrid. Goya, the artist who created the stunning masterwork, was a tempestuous creator whose later works would be marked by darkness, disturbing themes, and what some art historians have called madness. By 1812, Goya was deaf, having lost his hearing to an illness. Some say he threatened Wellington with a pistol to get him to sit for the portrait, but there's no historical evidence to support that story. Comparing Goya's portrait of Wellington to other depictions of the general, his Wellington is drawn in the light, with red highlights popping in his hair. It is a curiously colorful portrait, especially when compared to Goya's other later works. On his uniform, Wellington carries the Order of the Golden Fleece, an honor bestowed by the Spanish. His eyes are drawn large and seem sad, even though the painting was done after what some historians consider one of his greatest victories. Wellington was known to have said, "Nothing except a battle lost can be half so melancholy as a battle won." Despite his many successes, he saw much of dead and sacrifice through his career. Perhaps that is what Goya attempted to capture in the portrait. Wellington gave the completed painting to his sister-in-law, who in turn gave it to her sister, Louisa, who was the wife of the 7th Duke of Leeds. The portrait remained the property of the family until 1961, when the 11th Duke of Leeds, John Osborne, put the artwork up for auction. The portrait was sold to an American art collector and oil tycoon named Charles Wrightsman for £140,000, but the British government was appalled that a master work of a British hero like Wellington would be sold to a foreign collector, and so they put a hold on the permit that would allow the painting to be shipped. Wrightsman, who disliked the sudden attention garnered by his purchase, offered to sell it to the British government for the cost he paid at auction, £140,000. There was a scramble, and between a foundation and additional government funds, the transaction was completed. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Goya's Wellington was to remain in England. The National Gallery in London set up a special display for the portrait to celebrate its acquisition. A special frame was constructed for it, and it was displayed all by itself, a decision which was probably lamented later. Until the theft of the Wellington, the National Gallery's biggest concerns had been defacement of the art, threat of fire, or war. Suffragettes had damaged paintings at various times in the gallery's history. Suffragette Mary Richardson slashed the Rokeby Venus by Diego Velázquez with a meat cleaver as a political protest over the British government's arrest of Emmeline Pankhurst. On August 22, 1961, the portrait of Wellington was missing, but at first there was a delay in reporting because museum personnel assumed that the painting was a way to be cleaned. As soon as it became clear, though, that the painting had been stolen, the British government jumped into action, searching nearby bus stations and train depots, trying to get the painting before it could be removed from the area. Through a few clues left at the scene, they deduced the thief climbed into the man's bathroom from a ladder placed in a courtyard that had been left open for renovations. The drop from the window to the courtyard was relatively steep, about 14 feet, and they believed only someone extremely physically fit would have been able to manage it, carrying an artwork with such a large frame. Although the frame had been constructed with emergency removal in case of fire in mind, it measured 33 by 28 inches and was built out of sturdy wood. Investigators also noted that the Wellington portrait went missing 50 years to the day after the theft of the Mona Lisa from the Louvre on August 21, 1911. They began to develop theories that the heists were somehow connected, perhaps a copycat thief, or even, some opined, the same person, as a young man who was in his 20s in 1911 would have been in his 70s at the time that the Wellington was stolen, though the sheer physicality of the crime brought that theory into doubt. Though viewing the portrait was popular before its theft, even more thousands of visitors flocked to the display to see the empty spot where Wellington had sat after it was taken. Newspapers ran headlines full of shock and dismay. Phone calls and tips about the theft poured in from across the country. One tipster claimed he had sold the portrait and was going to sneak it out of the country on a plane. Another said he'd return the painting if a donation would be made to his favorite charity for nuclear disarmament. All were false trails, except one. A handwritten note with block letters was sent to the Reuters news organization that said, "Query not that I have the Goya," but went on to describe markings on the back of the painting that the National Gallery used to determine that the note must be authentic. The note went on to say, "This is an attempt to pick the pocket of those who love art more than charity," and said that the portrait would be held for a ransom of £140,000, the same amount that had been raised to keep the portrait in the country. The note further went on to demand that the thief be given a pardon or held harmless from prosecution for the crime. This motive perplexed the authorities. Generally, they told the press, crimes were committed for greed, not charity. But the fact that the thief referenced the exact amount paid by the government and foundation for the artwork pointed to the idea of a person outraged by government spending. Anonymous tips continued to pour in. Reuters received a phone call from a woman who claimed to be the author of the handwritten letter. She said if the ransom wasn't paid, she would steal a Renoir from the National Gallery in retaliation. In response, the National Gallery upped security around its Renoir collection, but nothing ever came of the threat. The National Gallery offered a £5,000 reward for information leading to the recovery of the portrait. They said it was a crime that had caused the whole nation to suffer. Despite this reward offer, the investigation cooled until July the next year when another handwritten note, with a similar appearance to the previous ransom demand, arrived in the mailbox of the Exchange Telegraph. It said, "The Duke is safe, his temperature cared for, his future uncertain. We want pardon or the right to leave the country." The authorities didn't respond to this letter either. Meanwhile, in the cinematic world, when Dr. No, the first James Bond movie starring Sean Connery, was released in 1962, Connery's character James Bond spies the missing portrait in the lair of the titular character Dr. Julius No. It seems that the theft of the portrait had continued to capture the public's imagination. In December 1963, another note arrived, asking for money for release of the painting and a pardon for the crime. Again, authorities did nothing. Finally, on March 16, 1965, the author of the ransom notes wrote to suggest the painting be displayed and the funds raised in that manner. Again, the note was ignored. The authorities could not negotiate. However, 2 days after the final note arrived, the Daily Mirror newspaper published an article with the headline, "The Missing Goya in the Mirror, Our Sporting Offer to the Mystery Letter Writer." It suggested the art thief trust the Daily Mirror with the location of the painting, and the newspaper would do all that it could to get it displayed and money given to the charity of his choice. In response, the newspaper received a letter from the purported thief, asking if they could guarantee that they would raise at least £30,000. The newspaper published a letter in response saying that they couldn't make any guarantees, but they would make a good faith attempt to work with the National Gallery to meet the demands. Finally, in May, the newspaper received a receipt for an item left at a Birmingham luggage station. Authorities raced to the spot and they recovered the Wellington, tightly wrapped and seemingly none the worse for its years-long adventure. It was only missing its specially constructed frame. Attendants at the station said the portrait had been dropped off by a young man who gave his name as Mr. Bloxam. The entire world wondered, was this the thief? The National Gallery refused to work with the Daily Mirror to raise money for the art thief's charity, but still the newspaper congratulated itself for succeeding where investigators had failed for years. Goya's Wellington was safely back in the National Gallery. Arthur Milton Estra recognized the ridiculousness of the situation in his book, The Art Stealers, when he wrote, "The man who had once asked £140,000 for the portrait had ended up paying 14 cents to get rid of it." The letter writer was incensed by what he saw as a violation of his good faith. He wrote 2 additional letters to the newspaper. One read, "We took the Goya in a sporting endeavor, and you, Mr. Editor, pinched it back by a broken promise. Furthermore, you have the effrontery to pat yourself on the back for your triumph. Animal, vegetable, or idiot." Everyone expected that to be the end of the affair. The thief could have easily disappeared into thin air, taking his crime with him to the grave. But in July, a man turned himself in to authorities, confessing that he had taken Goya's Wellington, accidentally confessed his crime to a drinking buddy, and wanted to turn himself in before the reward money was claimed. His name was Kempton Bunton. He was 61 years old and lived in Newcastle upon Tyne. He said he stole the painting to raise money in order to pay television viewing licenses for seniors on fixed incomes who couldn't afford it. Bunton went through the details of the theft, saying he went in through the window, took the portrait in a van, stashed it in an apartment until the search died down, and then moved it north. The government charged him with theft of the portrait, theft of the frame, threats towards some of the gallery officials, and for depriving the public of the ability to enjoy the painting. Bunton's defense claimed that he was not guilty because he had stolen the painting with the intent to return it, reaching for a loophole in British law. The last portion of the Larceny Act of 1916 describes the crime of theft as being committed with the intent at the time of such taking permanently to deprive the owner thereof. Bunton said he intended to return the painting the entire time. His lawyer argued in court, "You may think the law stupid on this, but the law is the law. If someone goes into your house and takes your television set because he wants to watch a football match and then keeps it, it is extremely irritating and annoying, but it is not stealing." The court found Bunton only guilty of taking the frame, because unlike the painting, it was never returned. The judge sentenced Bunton to 3 months in prison, saying, "Motives, even if they are good, cannot justify theft, and creeping into public galleries in order to extract pictures of value so you can use them for your own purposes has got to be discouraged." Some suspected the judge also gave such a light sentence because he doubted that the elderly and overweight Bunton could have completed such a crime on his own without accomplices. Years later, there was a surprising twist that was revealed in some declassified government documents. It seems that Bunton's son John had eventually admitted to authorities that he was the one that stole the painting in support of his father's charity scheme. When authorities asked him why he hadn't come forward while his father was on trial, he said that he was merely respecting his father's wishes. It was John Bunton, who was young and spry, who had snuck into the National Gallery and stolen the painting, although his father had helped him to stash it and to write the letters. And then when the newspaper promised to raise the funds, he was the one who played the role of Mr. Bloxam, who had dropped the painting off at the drop-off point. John Bunton was never charged with any crime with relation to the theft of the Goya Wellington. Some historians have speculated that the pair probably concocted the scheme in order to get money and had come up with the story about the charity donation at the point that it made it clear that the government wasn't going to negotiate with them, because pundits on television had been talking about the very loophole that the pair eventually exploited in order to avoid most of the culpability for the crime. The 1968 Theft Act, a revision of the criminal law, addressed the theft of Goya's Wellington specifically with the addition of the words, "Removal of articles displayed or kept in churches, art galleries, museums, and other places open to the public." The government noted the need for the change, citing a striking recent instance in the removal from the National Gallery of Goya's portrait of the Duke of Wellington. In a way, the Duke of Wellington, who the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson described as one of England's greatest sons, continued to serve his country after his death because of the theft of his portrait that led to a modernization of the law that gave greater protection to important historical artifacts, religious relics, and works of art. Kimton Button died in 1976, but his charity wish was eventually fulfilled because in the 1990s, the British government started to give TV licenses free to seniors 75 years and older.
You know, so these two stories do end up having a lot of kind of interesting similarities, and I mean, of course, there's some differences as well. But I think one of the interesting things is that they're both kind of framed as this like kind of protest. That because they steal the just judges and they leave this thing about how it was taken from the Germans, and then with this one they have this for people who love art more than charity, which is an odd.
But I mean, the reasoning for it, which of course it might have popped up later as they were trying to not make it sound like they just stole it for money, but the reason for it is something that Americans have trouble understanding because in the United Kingdom and in much of the world, you pay a license fee to own a TV. And so what that license fee does is it pays for BBC. It pays for you to get TV without ads. So, I mean, essentially TV is a subscription service in the United Kingdom, but that's a tax. It's a TV tax. And so his complaint was you're a retiree or a pensioner, they'll call them in the UK, and you got nothing to do, sit around and watch TV, and you can't afford to pay the TV tax. Yeah. And so he wanted to steal the painting in order to convince the government to help pay for the TV tax, which they did for a while. They had a subsidy for people over the age of 75, and I understand they just got rid of that subsidy. The other thing that's funny to me about the tax license fee, which there's different opinions on that in the UK about whether they should have that or if it's too expensive. But it's a much lower fee for a black and white TV, which first of all makes no sense to me because it's paying for production cost and
why would that?
Nothing's produced in black and white, right?
Yeah, that's not going to cost you less to make it.
But people still have black and white TVs.
They have black and white TVs purely because you can pay less money for that.
They still exist, so that you can pay £50 a year as opposed to £150 a year, or £170 a year, whatever it is, to watch your television. If you're a pensioner and the price you have to pay is to watch your TV in black and white, man. That's cruel. That's cruel.
Well, in these days, I guess I don't know what you can stream stuff, so maybe you don't have to.
No. It's no matter how you get the TV.
No matter how you.
So
get
they
work
TV. They're very much trying to stop you from streaming the BBC without paying the television license fee. Yes.
Well, I guess that's it's different than what we do here, but not to say that we
watch the BBC here, but we just get it with ads, so we just pay for it. We pay for it.
Yeah, we pay for that. That's how we've paid
for
Netflix. Television, or
that's the other alternative. Is that they're about a third of them think it's okay to have the license fee. About a third of them say let's do it with ads, and about a third of them say why don't we do it as a subscription service? So it would be like like Netflix.
Anyways,
but that was the cause for which the Goya was stolen.
Supposedly,
was to pay your TV tax.
Supposedly, and I can kind of understand why someone might complain. It is interesting, and we kind of saw that in the last one too, where this idea of a piece of art representing national pride, and that
it was intentionally stolen as something that would have a visceral national interest.
Since they wouldn't have, they didn't even want to let it leave the country. It's a little underhanded of the UK to basically be like, oh, you bought it? Well, we're just not going to let it leave.
We're blackmailing it. Well, I mean, if someone from the UK purchased Peel's Washington,
that's fair. I mean,
would we try to do something to stop it? Right?
It's a matter of what we think belongs to the heritage of the nation, and pretty much all nations have that kind of stuff, and there's paintings and things that it's why a lot of that stuff has ended up owned by the state or by a museum within the state, but some of it isn't, and that's exactly what happened to this piece. But they raised the money to buy it, and I guess that his complaint is, you can raise the money to buy this, but not to entertain pensioners, which I guess I understand. I guess I get his point.
Or that might have been it was just to raise attention to the fact that retired people can't watch their television, or I don't know. So it is interesting that it was stolen supposedly for a political cause, but they're really asking for money. It also has in common interesting is that the guy that eventually admits to doing it did not appear to have the physical capability to do it. So it's both of them were like some old
Yeah.
guy with a plot,
Yeah, and so what eventually his son says that he was the one who actually did it, but he's
Yeah,
never
probably
actually
it was-
punished.
Probably it was the son that was the one that climbed
It
through a
is-
skylight and hid in a bathroom and did all the.
Yeah, which required some physicality, and then managed to get back down with what was a fairly heavy piece. Both of them too. There's this. It takes them a minute to figure out that it's gone. The guy at the church finds out
that must just be taken out for cleaning. Don't they have a list somewhere? Don't they? They write
it
that
is-
down on a legal pad somewhere.
it is
This is where the Goya
astonishing.
is. Yeah.
You think that this stuff that's like so important, you would think that, and people care about enough that they won't let it leave the country, would be protected somehow, and yet both of these cases essentially someone just walks in.
Yeah, but it's interesting because in the scene in Doctor No, which is really, it's clearly facetious. It's they look at it humorously. So was the public that concerned? Because it would seem to me that if they were truly that concerned, then the way that was presented in Doctor No would not likely have been done, because it was done as if this was almost kind of a joke,
Yeah, it would have made people upset rather than been a joke, it's interesting too that it had this kind of reference in the pop culture, reference within and it's I think people clearly were also like, wow, I can't believe that someone just walked in there.
Yes,
and at least this guy
would
climbed
think
through
from the
a window,
National Gallery, and that would be more difficult to do. Probably not the most valuable piece in the National Gallery, and it makes you wonder.
Yeah,
could you get into the British Museum and make off with the Rosetta Stone, and then so they find it 20 years later in somebody's garden?
It seems like that should be fairly difficult.
You would hope that it would at least require a Mission Impossible movie to get.
Yeah, as opposed to my plan is to bring a ladder.
Yeah, to climb through the skylight, hide in the toilet, and just walk off with the thing. Yeah,
that's pretty. But they connected it to the Mona Lisa, which is an interesting.
Which was also stolen. Fairly. Yeah. Of course, the Mona Lisa didn't get famous till it was stolen. Really, the theft of the Mona Lisa is what made it so famous. But yeah, that the same thing. There were it was gone and for a while, and then they're like, oh, that's not off being cleaned. Then where is it? And and it turns out it was stolen for political purposes, and it was recovered. So there's a lot of it's. There has certainly been art theft for art theft, but these thefts were interesting in that they seem to be stolen for purpose. They seem to be stolen not by the people you would think of as art. Yeah. If you were to watch a movie, these were not the same sort of individuals that you would see involved in the plot to steal a famous piece of art. And they were doing it just to make some sort of statement. So it also shows the power of art as a cultural memory. How important that is to the whole cultural idea that people would act out in that way, that they're doing it with this piece of artwork.
Well, and I guess it's why people target art in protest at all. That's why people are throwing soup on art. It's less about. They'll talk about how you care more about the art than stopping
the environment
but it's still, the real reason they do that
TV
is
cost.
Because they want you to. They want the headline that says,
"Yes,
climate activist, attempts to destroy."
It's definitely working under the "any publicity is good publicity" idea.
Yes.
But yes, they're doing it because it's going to get attention, and that's what they want is attention.
They figure throwing this,
that group's also super gluing themselves to runways, to try to stop aircraft and stuff.
Protests. they do whatever protests they can.
We try to stay out of politics here, but I can say that if you're super gluing yourself to something, I'm dubious as to the.
I've never quite understood and I guess they're in general probably not really threatening these pieces of artwork, but
because they've got a glass cover or something.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I've never been to a museum where you could just walk in with soup.
Yeah, right. But usually, I don't know. I don't like.
Usually, they
things.
make you put your bag in a locker or something in Europe to go view the museum.
But it is interesting that we essentially. This has remained in a kind of a method of this kind of thievery, and it's true that in both places the thieves at least claimed to care about the value of the piece, that it was a culturally important piece, and that's why they didn't want to destroy or injure it.
Do damage to the piece, though we honestly don't know with just judges if they might have done that, but
we don't know.
Yeah, the Goya Wellington seems to have been taken care of, and that their intention was always to give. Well, as a matter of fact, their defense later was my intention was to give it back, which is another funny twist in this story because when they changed the law They essentially wrote an exception for stealing stuff from the National Gallery. Still, if a guy busts into your home and steals your television set,
And
but
intends
plans to give it back, it's not theft. But you can't do that with the Goya Wellington. That's how they changed the law. But they also found out if they steal your TV and they bring back the TV but not the cabinet, then they can be they can be convicted of stealing the cabinet.
Well,
and he eventually was jailed for stealing the frame.
Which was an expensive frame that they had put some work into, but
I would imagine. I doubt there's any cheapo frames, like the ones you get off of Amazon. I doubt there's any of those.
I doubt they had that framed
Gallery.
at Hobby Lobby.
But I mean, and the Goya is still there, the National Gallery, and there are lots of great museums in London. You can go see it. Couple interesting things about this one. One is that there was a movie made about this theft. 3 years after we made the episode?
Yeah, something like that.
So, I mean, we had no idea I swear to you, I had no idea that a movie was being made when we made the episode, but we presaged that, and so it got another view. But one of the things about this, that's a good story, I'm not sure everybody knows, but I worked in financial services for a good deal of time. I used to work for Merrill Lynch back in the day. They're not paying me to, this is not a sponsorship ad or something like that. I worked for Merrill Lynch. All my time at Merrill Lynch, I never made the Wall Street Journal. I mean, obviously I didn't do anything important enough to make the Wall Street Journal. That was a big deal at Merrill Lynch. You did something to get in the Wall Street Journal. This episode, the Wall Street Journal Online did a story about art theft, and they linked this episode. They said, here's an episode from the history guy talking about this art theft. And so I had to wait till I was the guy that makes videos in his basement before I made it in the Wall Street Journal, which all of my financial friends from back in the day, it was always their great ambition. So yes, this one is quite interesting. It was interesting that we kind of predicted the movie before the movie came, and it's interesting because apparently there was a little enough discussion about this theft online that when the Wall Street Journal was looking for something, were what they came up with, which was
the story. It is. I mean, it is just it's a brazen thievery. They just walk in.
Yeah,
I also think they called it
people who just don't see. These are not. These are people who had special forces training during the war.
Well, and they, the fact that the newspapers who brings it in, I again understand what the authorities were doing here, but still feel like perhaps there was something more they could have done.
When the newspaper brings it in, but and then the guy's mad because the newspapers, you can't trust.
We stole it. It was a sporting endeavor, and you're not. Not fair.
Not pay the ransom that you promised.
I think it's funny that they actually expected to get the money after that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, that was going to happen. Well, and at that point, we don't know. Was it just straight up stolen for money, and then they made up later this cause in order to get out of the fact that it was clear they weren't ever going to get any money out of it? Or the thing is, these were truly amateur thieves in every sense of the word, and they had no idea what you would do. How you would hawk the Goya Wellington. This was not a Bond villain. This was not a Bond villain.
No, and you do wonder because you can't sell it. How do you sell the thing? And I wonder I think that about Just Judges too. Is how would they have unloaded it? And I don't know. Is this sitting in a collection, some private collection somewhere, and they don't want to mention it because they've acquired it
occasionally
illegally?
They discover things in collections that had been actually stolen years before. So it might be. In both of these cases, though, I think the idea was to ransom it back for some purpose to the people that they stole it from, and that puts you in a bind because you know who you have to negotiate with, and they know who they have to negotiate with, and neither one of these I think worked out for the thief.
If we learn anything, if there's a lesson to learn here, it's that crime doesn't pay.
Crime doesn't pay. The cheese guy got off better. The guy. At least he got off with some cheese.
Yeah, he. Although I guess.
Well, no, they did catch him though. They eventually did catch the cheese guy. I don't know how much of the wheel of cheese he had consumed before they figured that out. I don't know.
The fact that
he was not planning on giving the cheese back. Yeah.
No, that was probably not.
The fact that the cheese guy plays heavily in the story. There's just some humor to the story, aside from the fact that this is risking invaluable, priceless pieces of art. Is that these stories are both just bizarre stories, and you got to find some humor in it.
Yeah, the cheese guy's like, I saw a black car and there were two dudes in it. Like that's our biggest lead.
The cheese guy is your story. The cheese guy is your witness. Is the guy that stole cheese and that that the stolen wheel of cheese ends up playing into the story. That really kind of encapsulates the entire episode here of how bizarre these two art thefts were.
Yeah.
These were not geniuses that they're going to make a movie on. These were and yet from apparently fairly normal people, and people who couldn't slip through the window or do any of the things that you would expect you to have to do. They successfully stole this art, and they just couldn't figure out what to do with it when they got it. I mean, that's what really happened to both of them. They would have gotten away with it if they had any idea what to do after you make your theft.
But they steal it, and they're like, all right, now we send a ransom note, and they both do. And I mean, the authorities didn't bite in either case. They were just like, nope, we're not going to do this.
And then the criminal's like, now what? Now what do I do?
And it worked out for Goya's Wellington that we managed to get that back. But I mean, gosh, it's just as easy, the Just Judges was thrown in someone's fireplace because they didn't want to get caught.
Because they didn't want to. They didn't want to get caught. There's other examples of that in history where someone's stolen something that's so unique.
Yeah.
That then there's no way for you to be able to get rid of it. When someone stole one of the pairs of Dorothy's ruby slippers.
Yeah.
And they disappeared for years because then what do we do with it? And I think those actually were recovered recently.
I want to say that they were recovered too. I feel like I saw an article on that, but it is. I mean, these are incredible stories, and this is an interesting bits of history. And I mean, honestly,
these are both really good stories. They're fun stories to listen to. They're compelling bits of history. They do talk about art in terms of what it means in history, so that it's it's important when it's stolen. But I would say, as the history guy, I was disappointed these episodes didn't do better than they did, because I think people saw the titles and said, I don't care about art history. And when you get to them, they are really good. I mean, just like what we do with the history guy, these are good stories. They're good stories of history. And I think it occurred on land, but I think you maybe can call the people who stole these pirates, right?
That's at least it's
art
land
piracy. Yes, yeah,
art pirates.
So all good stories.
Someone in the Just Judges one, some guy might have taken the original and used it to paint a replacement. So that feels like that. I mean, that's basically piracy, right?
It's piracy.
In the
copyright piracy. It's just like piracy. It's just like pirating your videotape.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.